The cell doors slam shut with a metallic clang, followed by the whir of energy restraints activating. A dozen alien eyes turn toward the newest prisoner, an outlier among them, a human. He stands in the center of the holding area, wrists bound, expression unreadable. The other inmates, hulking war beasts, venomous assassins, and seasoned mercenaries, exchange knowing glances. A soft chuckle ripples through the crowd. Humans don't last long here. This is Black Iron, a maximum security prison orbiting a dying star. It's where the worst of the worst are sent. Pirates, warlords, and Deathworld exiles. No guards patrol the inner cells. No rules govern survival. You make your own order, or you become part of someone else's. And yet someone thought it was a good idea to throw a human in here. A reptilian brute twice the man's size slithers forward. Its armored scales scrape against the floor as it towers over him. Rows of needle-like teeth bared in a grin. First time in Black Iron, human? Silence. The reptilian tilts its head, amused. Humans are chatty creatures, always quick with words. Negotiations, threats. But this one? He just stares. Calm, watching. The brute's grin widens. Here's how it works. You pick a faction or you get picked apart. A few of the other prisoners step closer, eager for the show. A Deathworlder fresh off the transport is always an easy mark. But then something shifts. The human doesn't flinch. He doesn't tense, doesn't tremble. Instead, he breathes in deep, slow and steady. And for the first time, something unnerving slithers through the air. The others sense it too, a predator's stillness, the kind that doesn't fight for survival, the kind that fights because it wins. The reptilian blinks, momentarily thrown off. It had expected fear, please, a desperate scramble for protection. Instead, it's met with something it doesn't recognize, a threat. Then the human finally speaks. No, the reptilian's grin falters. No. Before it can react, the human moves fast, faster than anything should. A sharp crack echoes through the cell block. The reptilian staggers back, a jagged fracture forming along its armored jaw. A single strike, delivered with precision, strength, and no hesitation. The room falls silent. The human exhales slowly, shaking out his hand like he just swatted a fly. Then he steps forward, closing the space between him and the dazed reptilian. I pick my own side. Another blow. This time to the throat. The reptilian chokes, its massive frame crumpling. The rest of the inmates tense, suddenly unsure. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The human looks around, his gaze sweeping over the gathered criminals. He doesn't posture, doesn't gloat. Just watches, calculating. Then finally a slow smirk. Anyone else want to introduce themselves? No one moves. Because in that moment, they understand. The newest inmate of Black Iron isn't here to survive. He's here to rule. The silence in the cell block lingers far longer than it should. The reptilian brute is still on the ground, wheezing, one hand clutching the shattered jaw. The other inmates, a mix of hardened killers and warforged mercenaries, shift uneasily. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Humans were fragile, weak, soft-bodied mammals that relied on technology and alliances to survive in the brutal vastness of the galaxy. Yet here stood one, perfectly still, utterly calm, like a predator that had just tasted its first kill. The human turned slightly, his sharp gaze sweeping across the crowd. No emotion, no smugness. Just the eerie patience of something that knows it's the most dangerous thing in the room. For the first time in years, Black Iron has something new to fear. A slow, deliberate clap breaks the silence. From the shadows of the upper-level cells, a figure steps forward. A Trilek, tall and skeletal, its translucent skin pulsing with faint bioluminescence. The species is known for its intelligence, its ability to read the smallest micro-expressions, to calculate a person's worth in seconds. It descends the steps gracefully, elongated fingers tapping against the rail. When it speaks, his voice is smooth, almost melodic. Impressive! You made your mark within minutes of arrival. Not many do. The human doesn't respond. The Trilek tilts its head. It doesn't like unreadable creatures, and this human is blank. His posture, his breathing, even his heartbeat steady. No fear, no tension, just readiness. I am Varesh, the Trilak continues. Some call me the Warden of Black Iron. Not an official title, of course, but it gestures vaguely to the surrounding prisoners. Power here is decided by influence, not by bars and keys. A few others nod in agreement. Varesh does control much of Black Iron. He doesn't fight for dominance, he manipulates it, deals, whispers, favors owed. He is the spider at the center of the web. He watches the human carefully, and you are. The human holds his gaze for a moment before replying. Mason. Varesh chuckles. Just Mason? No response. The Trilak hums in amusement, then gestures toward the still wheezing reptilian on the floor. That was Korak. He runs the enforcers. Well, ran. His friends won't take kindly to your little display. Mason doesn't look at Korak, doesn't shift his stance. Varesh's smile flickers slightly. This human does not care. He's not here to play the game. Interesting. The Trilak leans in slightly. If you want to survive, you'll need allies. I can offer protection, resources, a place in my network. Mason finally speaks. You want me under your thumb? Varesh grins. Oh no, nothing so crude. Let's call it mutual benefit. Mason's head tilts slightly, considering. Then, with a casualness that makes the air drop in temperature, he asks, what happens if I say no? The room shifts. Subtle, but noticeable. A few of Varesh's people step closer. Not obviously aggressive, but present. Watching, waiting. Varesh exhales, his glow pulsing slightly. You misunderstand, Mason. I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. His voice lowers, soft but edged. Black Iron is not a place for loners. You will be tested. And when that happens, you will want allies. Mason is quiet for a long moment. Then finally, noted. It's not acceptance, but it's also not outright refusal. Varesh nods, satisfied. For now. As Varesh retreats, another voice cuts through the air. Low, hissing. You got lucky, human. Mason turns. A new figure emerges from the crowd. Korak's second in command. A Ivren, bipedal, insectoid, with serrated mandibles and four-clawed arms. A species built for combat. Its exoskeleton is scarred, its eyes cold with calculated rage. Mason already knows what's coming. You think one lucky hit makes you strong? The Ivren sneers, stepping forward. You think you can just break Korak and walk away? A few of the enforcers move closer, emboldened. This is how power struggles work in Black Iron. Korak's crew can't afford to lose face. If they don't retaliate, they lose their standing entirely. Mason sighs inwardly. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't avoiding one either. The Ivren's mandibles click in amusement, mistaking his silence for hesitation. When I'm done with you, human, they won't even recognize your remains. Mason doesn't. Blink. Then he moves. No warning, no wasted motion. His fist smashes into the Ivren's thorax, denting the armored plating. The alien stumbles, clicking in shock. Mason follows up with a precise elbow strike to the side of its head, sending it crashing against the cell wall. The entire block goes still. The enforcers hesitate. They'd expected Mason to fight, sure. Maybe hold his ground, but this was surgical violence. The Ivren groans, staggering to its feet, its compound eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't ready for this. Mason watches it carefully, calculating. Then deliberately he steps forward, not to attack, to see if it backs down. The Ivren freezes. A slow realization spreads through the room. Mason isn't prey. He isn't even competition. He's something else entirely. The human tilts his head slightly. Then calmly, like he's discussing the weather, he speaks. Next time, don't warn me first. Then he turns his back on them and walks away. The final insult. The first lesson. Black Iron just learned something new. Deathworlders don't fight for dominance. They take it. Mason knew this was coming. Black Iron wasn't run by the prisoners. Not really. The enforcer gangs, the syndicate puppets, the so-called warden of Black Iron, they all played their little power games, clawing for scraps of control. But the real masters of this prison weren't behind the bars. They were outside them, and right now those masters were pissed. The guards came for him in the dead hours of the cycle. No alarms, no announcement, just the sudden click of his cell door unlocking, the heavy shuffle of boots. For them. Not in standard riot gear, too much hassle for this kind of work, but armored enough to send a message. Mason sat on his cot unmoving. On your feet, human. He didn't. The lead guard, a broad-shouldered brainiac with a face like hammered stone, stepped forward. Lieutenant Kralis. Mason recognized the name. One of Black Iron's head enforcers, not just a guard, a handler. Mason looked up at him, his expression unreadable. You gonna make this difficult? Kralis asked, his voice low. Mason's gaze flickered to the two behind him. One was already shifting weight onto his back foot, ready to lunge. The other, a coward, hanging back, hands tightening on his baton. The fourth guard, still outside the cell, watching, supervising. Mason exhaled, slow, measured, then without a word he stood. Kralis grunted. Smart choice? They marched him down the corridor, past rows of silent prisoners. Some watched with interest. Others deliberately looked away. They all knew where this led. Down past the central hall, past the loading bays, into the lower levels, where the cameras didn't work, where the screams didn't echo, where the only rule was how much a body could take before it broke. Mason had been in places like this before, and every time they thought he'd break. The room was bare, no restraints, no execution chair. Just concrete and space, room enough to work, but no cover to hide behind. Kralis stepped in first, rolling his shoulders. The other three followed, fanning out. Mason counted the distance between them, noted their grips. The Brinnick favored his left, old injury in the right shoulder. The second, Ivran, was too light on his feet, probably a striker. The third, a burly Daylor, not used to fights lasting more than 10 seconds. The fourth, the one still by the door. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to watch. Mason exhaled. You been making a mess of things, human, Kralis said, pacing slightly. Breaking Korak, embarrassing the Ivren, ignoring Varesh. That's not how things work in Black Iron. Mason said nothing. Kralis sighed. Fake disappointment. See, we let you soft skins in here because you know your place. You hustle, you deal, you die quietly. But you, he smirked, you been making waves. He turned, cracking his knuckles. So we're gonna fix that. Mason barely had time to shift before the first blow came. Kralis led with a heavy hook, fast for his size, but not fast enough. Mason slipped the punch, the force of it whipping past his ear. The second came from the Ivran, a precise snapping kick. Mason caught the movement in his peripheral vision, twisting just enough for it to glance off his ribs instead of caving them in. The Daylor charged. No finesse, just brute force. Mason turned into it, not away, absorbing the impact and rolling with it. Then he struck, a sharp elbow, upward into the Daylor's throat. The alien gagged, stumbling back. The Ivren moved next, fast, precise. But Mason had already calculated the angles. He ducked, caught the incoming limb, and drove his own fist into the Ivren's gut. The insectoid warrior crumpled. Kralis cursed, lunging in. But this time, Mason met him head on. A quick feint left. A shift right. Then torque, Mason's fist smashed into Kralis' side, right where that old injury was. The Brainiac howled, a sound of pain and disbelief, because this wasn't a prison scuffle. This was a calculated dismantling. The fourth guard hadn't moved. Mason turned to him now, stepping over the groaning forms of the others. Silence stretched. The guard didn't flinch, didn't react, just watched. And then, with deliberate slowness, he tapped his wrist. A signal. A door hissed open behind Mason. A second team stepped in. Bigger, heavily armored, carrying shock batons. Kralis, still wheezing, let out a ragged chuckle. You think we didn't plan for this? The first baton hit hard. Electricity ripped through Mason's muscles, forcing him to one knee. A second strike to the ribs, then another to the back of his skull. Mason gritted his teeth, refusing to yell. They wanted to hear him scream. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The beating continued, efficient, brutal, a methodical lesson in submission. By the time they stopped, Mason's body felt like fire and ice, pain lacing every nerve. He was on the ground, hands braced against the cold floor. Kralis crouched beside him, panting slightly. You should have played along, human. Mason spat blood, smiled. Kralis frowned, then realized Mason was still looking at him, still breathing steady, still waiting for what? A sound. Echoed from the halls above, shouting, chaos, then alarms. The fourth guard checked his wrist display. His eyes widened. Krallis's calm crackled to life. We have a situation. The transmission cut. Mason forced himself upright, his movements slow but controlled. Krallis stared at him, something uncertain flickering behind his eyes, because this wasn't fear. This wasn't panic. Mason had known this was coming, and he wasn't worried. Outside, the prison was changing, and so was the game. The alarm screamed through the prison. Red lights strobed along the metal corridors, flickering like battlefield. Fire! The distant roar of chaos echoed through the halls. Cells unlocking, prisoners surging, guards scrambling. It was starting. Jack Mason had been waiting for this. Krallis hesitated, just for a second. It was all Mason needed. His body was wrecked, bruised, burned, torn apart by the guards' batons. But pain was just information. Something to be acknowledged and pushed past. Mason lunged. Krallis barely had time to react before Mason's fist slammed into his throat. The Brinock staggered back, choking, instinctively reaching for his weapon. The moment his fingers wrapped around the baton, Mason was already moving. A step. A twist. He ripped it from Krallis's grip. One fluid motion. Mason swung it up hard, cracking the baton against Krallis's jaw. The Brinock hit the floor. The two remaining guards were still processing what had happened when Mason turned to them, his eyes dark, steady, waiting. They ran. Mason stepped into the corridor. The prison was tearing itself apart. Black Iron had been a pressure cooker for years. The gangs, the rivalries, the barely contained violence, all of it had been waiting for the right spark. Now it had erupted. The lower levels were in full riot. Explosions from makeshift weapons. Brawls spilling into corridors. Prisoners taking their revenge. Mason didn't waste time. He moved through the chaos like a predator through a burning jungle, his body running on pure instinct. A squad of guards turned a corner ahead. He dropped low, avoiding a stun blast, then closed the distance. 2 seconds, 3 hits, one guard crumpled. The other barely had time to shout before Mason silenced him. He picked up the second guard's shock baton. Dual wielding now. Good. The riot wasn't just about revenge. It was about opportunity. Mason moved fast, down to the detention blocks, where high-risk prisoners were still locked in their cells. A Ivren fighter slammed against the glass as he passed. Human, free me. Mason kept walking. Not that one. Further down, he found what he was looking for. Cell 217. Inside, a towering figure sat on the edge of his cot. Varesh. Mason tapped the panel, overriding the lock. The door hissed open. Varesh stood, stretching his massive frame. He looked down at Mason, his expression unreadable. Then he grinned. Took you long enough. They moved together, cutting through the halls like a storm front. Mason fought precise, brutal, efficient. Every strike ended in a drop. Every movement had a purpose. Varesh? Varesh fought like a wrecking machine. Where Mason broke joints, crushed throats, took out weapons, Varesh tore through everything in his path. They weren't part of the riot. They were above it. One target, one goal. Control the security hub. Mason could feel the momentum shifting. The guards were losing control. The prison was falling, and Jack Mason was just getting started. The prison was burning. Black Iron had fallen into chaos. Alarms howling, lights flickering, bodies littering the halls. The guards who hadn't run were dead, dying, or hiding behind the last secure barriers. Jack Mason stood at the center of it all. Calm, focused, calculating. This wasn't just a riot. This was a prison break, and he wasn't about to let it fail. Varesh slammed a guard's head against the security console, leaving a smear of blue blood on the screen. Try again. The terrified technician's fingers trembled over the keyboard. Mason wasn't sure if it was from pain or fear. I can't unlock the main hangar bay. The system's in lockdown, the guard stammered. Mason leaned in. Cold, steady, then tell me what can. The technician swallowed. Level 12. Admin access. You need a command override. Mason exchanged a glance with Varesh. Level 12 was deep in the core of Black Iron. No one had ever breached it from the inside. No one but them. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Most of the prisoners were fighting over control of the upper levels, tearing through what little security remained. But level 12? That was different. The guards here weren't running, they weren't scrambling, they were waiting. Mason saw it the moment they turned the final corridor. A full tactical squad, riot shields, kinetic rifles, heavy armor. They were dug in, covering the only way forward. Varesh exhaled. I hate this part. Mason twirled the stolen shock baton in his hand. Then don't get shot. The moment Mason moved, the air filled with gunfire. He ran straight at them. The first volley missed. They weren't expecting a human to charge head on. The second burst was too slow. By then, Mason was already on them. A shield came up. He stepped in, twisted, slammed his baton into the gap at the guard's neck. The soldier collapsed. Varesh followed, barreling through the line like a war beast. He grabbed a rifle, crushed the stock in his hands, and hurled the guard into the wall. It was over in seconds. Mason pulled the security key off the commander's corpse and pressed it to the door panel. The lock clicked green. They were in. The admin chamber was eerily quiet. A single control station, one console that controlled the entire facility. Mason walked up to it, blood dripping from his knuckles. A voice crackled through the speakers. You don't have to do this, Mason. He glanced at the screen. A security officer somewhere off site, watching. You break the lockdown, you'll never stop running. Mason smirked. Who says I have a plan to stop? He slammed the key into the override slot. The system hissed, screens flickering as control of Black Iron shifted. The hangar doors unlocked. Every surviving escape craft was now free to launch. Jack Mason had done the impossible. He had broken the unbreakable, and now he was getting out. The escape was nearly complete. Across Black Iron, prison doors stood open. Shuttles were firing. Up! The riot had turned into a full-blown exodus, but Jack Mason wasn't free yet, because standing between him and the final exit was the one man who hadn't run, hadn't begged, hadn't died, Warden Tarek, and he looked ready for war. Tarek wasn't like the other guards. He wasn't some coward in a uniform, hiding behind protocols and lockdowns. He was built like a war machine, 7 feet of hardened muscle, cybernetic augments lining his arms, and a reinforced exosuit designed for close quarters combat. He cracked his knuckles at a sound like steel grinding against steel. I knew you'd make it this far, Mason. Jack wiped blood from his mouth. Then you should have left while you had the chance. Tarek smirked. Not my style. Then he charged. Tarek hit like a shockwave. The impact sent Mason flying into a bulkhead. Pain exploded through his ribs. Didn't matter. He rolled aside just as the warden's fist cratered the metal where his head had been. Mason moved. Fast! He struck low, aiming for joints, soft spots, anything that wasn't reinforced. Tarek barely flinched. A backhand sent Mason skidding across the floor. You're tough, human, Tarek admitted. But I was built for this. Mason spat blood. Yeah? He pushed himself up. So was I. Tarek lunged faster than something that size should move. Mason dodged, barely. Too close. He needed an opening. And, then he saw it. The exosuit. All power, all armor, but it had a weak spot. The spine augments, right where the plating was thin. Tarek threw another punch. Mason ducked, rode behind him, and drove a stolen shock baton straight into the warden's back. The effect was instant. Electricity surged through Tarek's body. The exosuit shorted out. His limbs locked. Mason twisted the baton. Tarek collapsed. Breathing hard, Mason stepped over him. Should have left, Tarek. The warden grunted, barely conscious. You think this is over? Mason just smirked. Then he walked away. The hangar was ahead. His ride out of here, behind him, Black Iron was burning. Jack Mason had done the impossible, and now nothing in the galaxy could stop him. The alarms were still blaring. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning circuits. Jack Mason sprinted through the last corridor, his boots clanging against the metal floor. Behind him, the prison was falling apart, a mix of riots, fires, and dead guards left in. His wake. Ahead, the hangar doors were wide open. His ticket to freedom sat on the launch pad, a stolen prison shuttle, engines humming, waiting for takeoff. But between him and that shuttle, more guards. They were desperate now, cornered animals. Blasters were raised. Orders were shouted. Stand down, Mason. Jack didn't. He charged. A guard fired. Jack dodged, grabbed the bastard's rifle, and slammed the stock into his face. Another lunged. Jack twisted his arm till it snapped. 3 more. Not a problem. By the time the last one hit the floor, Jack was already moving. The shuttle door hissed open. Jack leapt inside, slammed the controls, and punched the ignition. Engines roared to life. The ship shuddered, rising off the platform. Outside, more guards rushed in, firing wildly. Too late! Jack grinned. With a flick of a switch, he fired the thrusters and blasted out of black iron. The prison fell away behind him, swallowed by chaos and flame. Jack Mason? He was finally free. The Galactic Penal Authority refused to believe it at first. A human had broken out of black iron, the most secure prison in the sector. Impossible! No one had ever escaped, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Security. Logs erased. Guards missing or dead. A stolen shuttle gone from the hangar. Jack Mason had done what thousands of the worst criminals in the galaxy only dreamed of. He had escaped. Warden Wagner sat in silence, his claws twitching on his desk. His career was over. His legacy shattered. More than the loss of control, more than the utter humiliation, there was something that haunted him most. Mason didn't just escape. He tore through the prison like it was made of paper. The cameras told the story. He outfought every guard. He broke the riot's strongest warriors. He survived injuries that would kill anyone else. He didn't stop, not once. Not until he was free. Word spread, fast, from cell blocks to shadowy back alleys across every prison and criminal underworld in the known galaxy. The human did it. Black iron wasn't unbreakable. And worse, it wasn't humans that were weak. It was everyone else. The first rumors made him sound like a monster. Some said he had claws, that his eyes glowed red in the dark, that he laughed as he tore through the guards like a wild beast. Others whispered that he was something worse. Not a man, but a force of nature, something that couldn't be broken, couldn't be stopped. A true Deathworlder. And with every retelling, Jack Mason became something more than just an escaped convict. He became a legend. Jack leaned back in the pilot's seat, watching the stars stretch out before him. The stolen ship was running low on fuel. He'd have to find a station soon, maybe a job, maybe a new identity. But for now, he was free, and he wasn't worried, because if there was one thing the galaxy had just learned, Jack Mason didn't lose.